And my secretary who answered the phone. When he announced who he was, she had no idea it was the Mark Cuban. So she called, she patches me through and says, "Oh, I just want to let you know there's somebody named Mark Cuban on the phone for you." So it was just, it was really hilarious. It was really hilarious.
The Abstract is brought to you by SpotDraft, an end-to-end contract lifecycle management system that helps high-performing legal teams become 10 times more efficient. If you spend hours every week drafting and reviewing contracts, worrying about being blindsided by renewals, or if you just want to streamline your contracting processes, SpotDraft is the right solution for you. From creating and managing templates and workflows, to tracking approvals, e-signing, and reporting via an AI-powered repository, SpotDraft helps you in every stage of your contracting. And because it should work where you work, it integrates with all the tools your business already uses. SpotDraft is the key that unlocks the potential of your legal team. Make your contracting easier today at spotdraft.com. What do you need to know about working with executive recruiters? And what advice might one of them have about how he found a fulfilling life after big law, including through his own much longer running podcast? Today, we have Richard Hsu joining us, a managing director at Major Lindsey Africa, a legal-focused executive recruitment agency. He's also been the host of his own podcast, Hsu Untied, it's a good pun, for nearly 10 years, and was previously a partner and the global head of IP transactions at Shearman and Sterling. Richard, thanks so much for joining me today on The Abstract.
Well, thank you, Tyler. It's very nice to be invited. As you know, I usually in your seat asking the questions and not usually in this seat. So hopefully I can be okay in answering your questions.
You're going to do great. I think, I've done an episode or two of other folks' podcasts, and having done that recording, it gives me some empathy for the seat that my guests are in. I think asking the questions is a little easier, but talking about yourself and your experiences is fun too. So before we get to chatting about careers in legal and whether starting a podcast might be a good idea for some of our listeners, I know you moved from the South Bay up to San Francisco a couple years ago. You're living in the city. I grew up down on the peninsula as well. I think SF is due for a rebound. So I wanted to start by just asking you, is there a place in San Francisco, coffee shop, restaurant, that's really special to you?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. I mean, and I do agree with your comment. The city, I think, is poised for a rebound, and I think it's already kind of rebounding. But one spot that I recently found that I really have fallen in love with is an area in the northwest corner of the city called the Presidio Tunnel Tops. It's near the Presidio Park. It's a newly developed urban parkway. And it's just this gorgeous grassy area, a completely hidden gem. And while you're standing in the Presidio Tunnel Tops, you literally have on one side a gorgeous view of the Golden Gate Bridge. And then you turn around to the other side and you see the entire skyline, including Salesforce Tower and the Palace of Fine Arts. And right in the center, in between these two things, you have this great view of Alcatraz. So it's just this glorious thing. And, on a clear day, which is kind of rare in the city, it's just a wonderful, wonderful place to just hang out and have lunch. And we go out there as much as we can.
That is great. I have not been there. And the next time I'm in San Francisco in late February, I will definitely go out and go for a jog or a walk. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, check it out.
Thanks for that. Richard, so before becoming an executive recruiter, you had a long career as a law firm partner, big law firm. I want to start back sort of at the beginning. What inspired you to get into the law in the first place? And was a partnership at a firm like that where you thought that you'd end up?
So I think the answer to both those questions is no. I was an engineer out of college. And in fact, if you had told me I'd be a lawyer, I probably would have shot you. That's how far from law I was thinking. I'd never considered it as a career. None of my family members are lawyers. I mean, really, it was never even on my radar. And after I graduated from college, I actually went to work as an engineer for a couple of years in Silicon Valley at Oracle. And
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about what else I wanted to do because I wasn't someone who loved programming all day long. And so I did want to do something else. And I was thinking about maybe business school or other things. And somebody I knew came up to me and said something like, well, you're an engineer. You should go become an intellectual property lawyer. And to show you how little I knew at that time, I barely even knew what a patent was. I mean, literally. So I was just like, really? And the only reason that I even considered going to law school, because I did a little bit of research after this, is that, as you know, law school is one of the few professional schools in which has no undergraduate requirements at all. So, unlike, say, medical school or something like that, the last thing I was going to do is go back to college and take a bunch of classes to go to law school.
Yeah.
So since there are no requirements whatsoever, and all you have to take is the LSAT, that's all you have to do is just take that test. I thought, well, what the hell? I mean, that's not a big deal. So I took the LSAT and I got a chance I got into Columbia Law School, and it was a chance to live in New York City. So I thought, hey, why not live in New York City? But
Yeah.
even after going to law school, I actually thought my chances of actually practicing were probably 50-50 because I figured, the law degree might be useful for something else. I could always go back and be an engineer. So I never felt the real pressure in law school to absolutely had to get a job. I mean, I enjoyed law school fine. I thought it was interesting, but I just didn't have that pressure because I figured I could always go back and be an engineer if I didn't like law school. Turns out, I obviously ended up practicing a lawyer, and 25 years later, here I am. But yeah, so it was really not something that was in any way a childhood dream of any kind.
That's interesting. I feel like on this podcast, it's probably more common that people stumble into the career, but you do have folks who knew, I wanted to be a prosecutor, or I wanted to, do appellate work from a very young age. The partnership, of course, comes along with good comp, but some heavy stress, I think you might agree. Those are high stakes gigs. How did you know that it was time to move away from big law, move on to something different? And I'm also curious if you've got any advice for folks who might be feeling a little bit burned out right now themselves.
Yeah. Well, there's no question being a partner at a big law firm is definitely stressful. And I think the stress seems like it increases year after year after year. I don't know that I have any advice on, kind of when is the right time to step out. This recruiting opportunity kind of presented itself. But I will say, just as anecdotally, we often joke around the fact that big law firm partners are pressured every day by GCs and clients on bills and billing rates, and yet they're expected to miss their daughter's wedding when they're needed. It's
Right.
just, it is just a really, really high stress job. So, and, even though I'm not in it right now, I'm talking to big law firm partners every single day. So I hear about it. And, honestly, I'm pretty grateful I'm not doing it. What I would say though is that the ones I think that survive best in it really are the ones that really love being a big law firm partner. I mean, that's really the best way of putting it, because if you don't really love it, then the stress is going to really wear at you and really eat at you. If you really love it, and some people really do, it's obviously not going to be as bad. But my advice, now to lawyers who, there are so many alternatives to big law. I mean, obviously there's always been in-house lawyers. That's obviously been always an option or alternative. But, there's now a lot of smaller law firms. There are these virtual firms. There's a lot of ways to practice law that doesn't have the pressures of being a big law firm partner. So fortunately, there are a lot of options out there. And for many people, that's just a much better answer to what they want to have in life.
When you were thinking of leaving big law behind, and maybe not behind because you still talk to partners all the time, but thinking of making that transition to being an exec recruiter, you're a really successful partner, you're almost leaving a little aspect of your identity behind. I got to ask you, was that a scary transition for you, or were you so ready for it? Yeah. What was that like?
Well, I think there are two stages of that question. I think, and this will be kind of a funny answer, because it did take a little while for me to give up, the title and everything like that, and the idea of becoming a recruiter. But funnily enough, I actually, when I first started, I didn't think it was going to be scary. I thought, oh wow, this should be easy. I've recruited people before. I've hired lawyers. I've mentored. I mean, I actually thought, oh, this will be actually easy. And what I actually found was when I got into the job, it was way harder than I thought. I mean, it was actually, the scary part actually came after I started the job, because what you realize when you start this job is that you think you know all these law firms because you've heard of them or you know lawyers there, but that's nothing compared to the depth and knowledge you've got to acquire in order to become a recruiter. I mean, you've got to understand,
Hmm.
the whole firm and the management and the strategy and what they're doing. I mean, it's a completely different. Knowing five lawyers at that firm doesn't give you any visibility into what the firm is about or what it's doing, and certainly to talk about it with another candidate. So really, that was a much steeper learning curve than I really ever dreamed. I just thought, oh, I already know
Hmm.
these firms. And similarly, I would say knowing the local culture is very important as well. And that's also something that you don't know as a law firm because they're your competitors. You're not going to know the personalities and who's in that law firm.
Yeah.
But when you're a recruiter, that's something you've got to explain to somebody, and that takes time. That takes a lot of meetings. That takes understanding what the firm office is doing locally. Anyway, so it was scary, but it happened after I took the job and started getting into it.
That's interesting. As you were ramping up on that, is that a lot of relationships that you really need to build sort of across the different firms? Is it really just conversations? How did you go about that?
Yeah, totally. And that's another area that I think I also underestimated is that, when you're working as a lawyer, you kind of think, wow, I know a lot of lawyers. I kind of know everybody. I grew
Mhm.
up in Silicon Valley. I worked my entire practice in the Valley. But what you realize is that your network is much smaller than you realize because you
Hmm.
don't really know who's outside your network. You know your network, you think it's big, but there are
Right.
tons of lawyers. And even today, I've been doing this business for 5 or 6 years. Every day I get calls from a firm, whatever, saying, "Have you heard of this person?" And no, I haven't. And they're right here in my backyard. So, it seems like, I mean, I know that it's a finite number of law firm lawyers in the Bay Area, but even in the Bay Area, which is the area that I focus on, there's a ton of people I don't know, and yeah, so I'm constantly networking and trying to get to know more lawyers.
That's really interesting. And maybe a good reminder for all of us that the world is much bigger than we might think on a day-to-day basis.
Totally, totally,
uh,
yeah, for sure.
I actually, I've interviewed one other exec recruiter on an earlier season of the podcast, and I think that your role, that of executive recruiter, is one that executives don't fully understand often, or don't quite know how to work with. So I've got a few questions here for you. Maybe to start with, in your own words, what does an executive recruiter do, and who do you serve?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in that way, in that sense, there's actually kind of two worlds in the executive recruiter world, and I'll limit it to
Mhm.
lawyers since that's the area that I obviously know.
Sure.
But the two ways that recruiters work, one is the retained search model, where basically you are retained by the client or the company to go out and find somebody. And so there the recruiter is very much working for the company, for the client. And so they're out, trying to find a person for that role. The other way that executive recruiters work or legal search recruiters work is what we call the sports agents, the sports talent, or the sports agency or talent agency model. And
Huh.
that's where you're really representing the candidate. You're focused on the candidate and you're trying
Mhm.
to find the best opportunity for them, much like a baseball agent would try to find the best team for a player. And
Right.
that's the sports agency. The sports agency model is the model that I happen to work in. In the law firm model, that's pretty common. So
Mhm.
I go out and try to represent a candidate and try to find the best opportunity for him or her.
If you were to put yourself in the shoes of a candidate who's looking for an opportunity, and maybe you can talk about both sort of the sports agent model versus the retained search model, and how the relationship with you might look a little different. What's advice you would have for them as they think about their relationship with someone like you, and also other exec recruiters out there? What should they be doing to position themselves best with recruiters?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I mean, in the retained search model, there's probably not a lot because if you are interested in the job, you kind of
Yep.
have to work with that recruiter because that recruiter is representing the job opening. So there it's pretty much set. But if you're more in the sports agency talent agency model and you're trying to select a recruiter to work with you, there are a couple of things that I think are really important. One of them, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is one of
Mhm.
them is who really knows the market and the law firms best. I mean, that's so important because the recruiter is going to be the one that's making recommendations. The recruiter is going to be one that's representing you, trying to pitch you the best. And if that person doesn't really know all the firms really in depth, they can't really provide an honest, biased, unbiased, answer for you. So that's really important. But even beyond that, I would say in the legal recruiting world, it's very much like real estate in the sense that somebody who knows the local market is very important because
Mm-hmm.
if you've ever done real estate, if you've ever sold or bought a house, you want the agent who knows that neighborhood really well, the nooks and the
Yeah.
crannies, where the noisy spots are, where the schools are, what are the local restaurants that people go to. I mean, it's so important once you know the area that a real estate agent knows that area. And in the same way, a legal recruiter, it's so important for them to know the local market because any recruiter or many recruiters can talk about the national firms or what their reputation is, the brand. I mean, lawyers know kind of what that firm is about, but who are the local personalities? Who's running the office there? What kind of practices are they really focused on? How are you going to fit in with the partners that are down the hall from you and the associates that they've hired? That's really, really important. And only somebody who has been in the local market and knows the personalities can really help you with that.
That's really interesting. As we think about maybe transitioning to some advice for career searchers, whether or not they have an executive recruiter helping them, your role is part coach too. So you see a lot of people going through interview processes. Any like truly tactical tips that you might have, especially in this era where norms and processes are shifting quite a bit because so much is happening in a remote way, for how to succeed at interviewing today?
Yeah. Well, I've got a long list, Tyler. I won't give you, you don't have time for my entire list, but let me just tell you a couple that I think are super crucial and also in light of the Zoom thing. My first tip, and I give this to almost every candidate interview, is when you're answering a question, the first 90 seconds are so crucial.
Mhm.
It's not about the 5 minute or 15 minute or longer answer. It's the first 90 seconds. And that's your opportunity, set the tone, go ahead and that allows you to set the tone, use a strong voice. That's a chance for you to really look the person in the eye. And in the age of Zoom, that's even more important because
Yeah.
you can't communicate that. You almost have to exaggerate a little bit your energy and enthusiasm, and so that is just super important. And that's what we really recommend. The other one that I say is the most important. Like I said, I've got a long list, but what I always tell candidates is look out for body language that you're getting. And if you say something that seems like it really resonates, write that down and use it again, because
That's
there's a
smart.
reason that resonated is probably going to be true, not just for that person you're interviewing, but for the other people in that company. So make a note of it, pay attention,
Hmm.
write it down, use it again.
If folks want to see the whole list, should they reach out to you? I don't want to
Yes,
flood your inbox.
yes, yes. I have a whole job interviewing tips that I give mainly to law students, but if anyone
Uh-huh.
is interested, definitely reach out to me and I'm happy to share with them.
That's fantastic. Quick announcement before I let you get back to the episode. SpotDraft just released our annual compensation report for in-house legal professionals. If you're wondering how your compensation compares to your peers across industries, years of experience, and more, make sure to check it out. Find it at salary-report.spotdraft.com or head to the link in the description. Now, let's get back to the episode. I think many of our guests may know that you're the host of your own podcast. That was actually how we got connected. Is I listened to a number of episodes, and you were kind enough to join the abstract. It's called Hsu Untied, as I said, and you've interviewed a whole host of legal leaders. You've also brought on a couple of famous folks. I think people might have heard of like Tony Robbins and Mark Cuban, and something for me to aspire to as I grow the abstract over time. Tell us how the podcast got started. What kicked it off?
Yeah. Well, funnily, the podcast was sort of like my childhood dream. I had always grown up listening to Terry Gross and Charlie Rose, and I just
Uh-huh.
loved the idea of what they did. And I thought if I could ever have a job where I just got to spend every day interviewing interesting people, that would be like my dream job. And of course, I never was able to have that dream job, but when the technology allowed, the whole podcast thing came about, I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to basically fulfill my childhood dream and ask people questions. So when I started that podcast, I literally just interviewed my friends. I mean, I would get my college friends, my law school friends, and I would interview them about their hobbies or whatever. And that's all it was. And when I started that podcast, I thought, if I can find 10 people to interview, I would be thrilled. And that was literally my goal. And I think now I'm probably close to 300 now, something like that. So it has
Yeah,
wildly exceeded my expectations. But the funny thing is that if you look at the list of my guests, and a lot of people ask me this question, as you noted, I've interviewed, Tony Robbins and Mark Cuban and, many sort of celebrities. People's always ask me, did you know them? Did you have a contact that made the introductions? And almost every guest on my podcast, I did not know. I just, cold emailed them. And Mark Cuban was a good example. I heard something that he talked about. I emailed him and asked if he could be on a podcast, and he amazingly responded directly to me. He emailed me back and
that's
he
awesome.
said, I'm happy to talk to you. And not only that, when we did the podcast, he was actually on vacation at the time, which just completely stunned me. But he did the interview, and one of the funny things that happened is that this was done. This is back in the old days when we were just interviewing by the telephone, and he was
Uh-huh.
calling me from his cell phone, and his cell phone dropped, and he called me back because he got cut off, and my secretary answered the phone when he announced who he was. She had no idea it was the Mark Cuban, so she called. She patches me through and says, "Oh, I just want to let you know there's somebody named Mark Cuban on the phone for you." So it was really hilarious. It was really hilarious.
Lucky that she didn't hang up and say that's an impersonator. And
So it's been a funny thing. Another one, Tony Robbins, which you mentioned. I'd been emailing Tony Robbins for probably the better part of a year and a half. And, every time his assistant kept saying, he's way too busy, he's way too busy. And I would just keep saying, look, if he ever has time, I'd love to have him. I understand. And one morning, I woke up like 7:30 in the morning, and I got this email saying Tony Robbins can talk to you in 45 minutes if you're available. And, luckily it's a podcast. I don't have to get dressed. I can do it in my living room. And I'm like, yeah, sure. That'll be great. So I got him. Apparently he had some random opening that just opened up in 45 minutes. And it was one of those lucky things where I just happened to be in town. I saw the email. I responded right away and, got a chance to chat with him.
huh, passion projects really can kind of blossom into something pretty cool. I mean, another lesson there is like, persistence pays off, or don't be afraid of the cold email, especially if you're not really asking for too much from someone, just a little bit of their time and their wisdom. That's great. And maybe one day I can get Mark Cuban to come on here, or I think his brother was a lawyer once upon a time, maybe his brother.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Okay, I know it's hard to pick favorites. I wouldn't pick favorite episodes, but if you had to pick one or two that you think folks should go and listen to, or that were particularly fun to create, what are a couple of your best?
Yeah. Well, two that I really like that just warmed my heart. And again, I'm not saying these are the two best, but two that I really love. One was Carol Spinney, who played Big Bird. And, it was just a
Wow.
thrill to get him. He's actually passed away since I've done the interview, but it was just a thrill to get him. I did not even know this at the time, but he actually played Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch on Sesame Street. And when I did the interview, he did both voices. He sang for me. I mean, it was just really thrilling and exciting. So, Big Bird was one that I just, really enjoyed doing. The other interview that was just super fun, kind of along the same lines, but just super fun, was Burt Ward, who played Robin in the 1960s television Batman series. And again, cold email, never known him or anything like that, but he was just an amazingly sharp guy who he just remembered every detail about the Batman TV series like it was yesterday. He was just brilliant. It was just amazing to talk to him. And, just to talk to somebody that you had obviously watched on TV as a kid is, always super fun.
That's really cool. Those are almost bucket list experiences that you were able to create through your desire just to, have some conversations and be a quasi journalist.
Totally.
That's fantastic. I know it wasn't the intention at first, but I've got to ask if you feel like the podcast has helped you in your work as well, helped build a sort of personal brand for you.
Yes, it has helped me, but in a way that actually is probably not in the way you think. When I started this recruiting job, I got a lot of advice saying not to take this job. And one of the reasons that people advised me not to take the job is they said, do you realize how much rejection you're going to get? Do you realize how many people are going to hang up on the phone on you? Do you realize how many
Yeah.
candidates you're going to pitch and law firms are going to say no? It'll be no, 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 and no. And the funny thing is that when I heard this, I was like, you know what? I'm actually totally used to this, because in building that podcast, that's basically what I get all the time is no's. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, you see the people that I do get, this, but
Yep.
you get a lot more no's or no responses. I mean, I get that all the time. So I
Yeah.
was totally used to that. And I felt like in a completely, random way, which was not the intention, the podcast, that aspect of the podcast training really prepared me well for the recruiting. Now I rejections don't bother me, because that's basically how, if rejection was going to stop me from doing the podcast, I would have never even got that thing off the ground. I mean, that's how
Right.
it was done. And so I was kind of used to that. And I was also kind of accepting the fact that, getting rejections is part of the process for
Mhm.
building something. And I had done that through the podcast. So recruiting, I was already used to that.
That really resonates. And it's a muscle that I think people who have more traditional sort of sales roles build very early on. And then, I mean, I'm sure you actually probably coach this with some of the law firm partners and others who you work with, which is, okay, if you're going to take it to the next level, you got to become a lot more comfortable with that type of rejection. A lot of people say yes. I'm very lucky, but I even have friends who say it's just not the right time, or I don't want to tell those stories right now, and those are totally valid, good reasons. Like, at least they got back to me, right? but you got to become comfortable with the idea that, okay, maybe only 40%, 50% are going to be yeses, and the others, it's not quite going to work out for whatever reason.
Totally, yeah.
I've had a couple of people who are interested in starting podcasts, one at least who's actually gone and done it, reach out to me for advice. I feel like I'm like 20 episodes in or so. I feel like I'm really still learning. So maybe both for my benefit and also for those who are out there who might be interested in starting a podcast or something like this, a newsletter or even a Substack. Any advice you've got?
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of thoughts on that. I would say, I think to make something like a podcast sustainable is that you really got to focus on the interview and how much you enjoy doing the interview, because as opposed to being concerned about the metrics and stuff like that, because if you're focused on that or overly focused on that, it will just drive you crazy. And I don't think it'll be a very fun thing. So I frequently tell my guests, because I get this question a lot, I frequently tell my guests that if the only two people that listen to this podcast are you and your mother, it's totally fine with me. So that's how I've been able to sustain my podcast. Now I realize not everybody can do this, because,
Sure.
for some people, the metrics are important, and, if you need to sell advertising, I get all that. But I do think that you really got to enjoy the process and the interview. That's the only way to make it sustainable. The second piece of advice I'll give you, and I think you can relate to this as well, is that in order to figure out what's a good interview or what's a bad interview, you've got to do a lot of them. There's an old saying about how can you tell the difference between good wine and bad wine? And the answer is drink a lot of bad wine. And really interviewing and the podcast is the same thing, is that you really can't tell an interview is good, which ones are good or which is bad, until you've just done a lot of them, because you're going to have good ones and you're going to have not so good ones. And once you've kind of done a lot of them, then you can start to realize, oh, wow, that was a really good interview. And that's how you start to really know when you're hitting your stride, or when, what it feels like to have a really good interview.
I think the other interesting thing there, I'm just going to build on that, which is that it's actually surprising to me sometimes which ones perform really, really, really well. And it's not always the ones that I would expect. It may not be the ones with the most controversial story, or, I mean, I don't have so many episodes that I'm going to tell you which ones are really good, right? Because I really appreciate all the guests who have come on and spent time preparing and are putting themselves out there and telling their stories. I mean, I was interested in all their stories, but it's actually interesting to me to see which ones perform well. Sometimes it might just be, it's that time of year and people have a little extra time, or for some reason the LinkedIn algorithm liked it more. But I think sometimes there are topics around personal branding, or how you position yourself with other execs in the team. Some of those things I found are really resonating, and that's been a learning experience for me too.
Interesting. Yeah, those are good.
Where can folks find your episodes if they want to give it a listen?
If they do, it's on my website, ShuUntied.com.
Fantastic. I've got just a couple more questions for you, Richard. I'm a big reader. I travel all the time for work. I'm always looking for books to read when I'm in the air. What's a good book that you've read recently? And you were, I think, just on a vacation, so I hope you're able to read a book. You were able to relax a little and maybe open a book.
Well, most of the nonfiction books that I've read actually are from my podcast. So to plug my own podcast, you're welcome to go and listen to some of my guests. But one that I recently read and had a really fascinating interview with is Jonah Berger, who's written a book called Magic Words. And the thesis of what he says is that there's a very powerful difference between using the noun form of a verb versus the adjective. And so let me give you just an example. If I tell you there are two individuals and I tell you that one is a runner and the other person does running, which one are you going to gravitate towards? Which one are you going to associate really good qualities? And that's probably the runner, because you're going to think that person is motivated, that person is disciplined, that person is well trained. You're going to associate this entire suite of characteristics around somebody who's a runner than somebody who says they just run. And so the whole book is building around, that's between run and runner is three letters, so it can really characterize someone in a much more positive way. And if you're conscious of that, you can use that to create a certain sense of, you can create your persona, you can communicate more effectively by just doing that. And the negative is also true too. Like, for example, there's a big difference between someone who has cheated and someone who's a cheater, right? Someone who's habitually a cheater, you associate all kinds of negative things. Somebody who has cheated once or whatever, it's a different kind of thing. So I won't belabor the point. You should go and read the book. He talked about it on my podcast. I was really moved by his interview. Read the book. It's really great. I think that's one that could really help you in what you do, because you're talking to people all the time, and you want people to have a certain image of you, Jonah, in the world. You should, it might be something interesting for you.
Fantastic. We will also definitely link to that in the show notes, so that way other folks can find the episode and find the book as well. As we start to wrap up, I like to ask this question to most of our guests. Sometimes there's a little bit of a change, but if you could look back sort of on the days of being a young lawyer when you were just getting started, what's something that you know now that you wish you'd known back then?
Yeah. I think the one thing that I wish I'd known that someone had explained to me is that being a lawyer is a client service business. And that the most important thing about being a lawyer, in order to be successful and happy, is that you've got to get real enjoyment from serving other people, because that's kind of the fundamental core of being a lawyer. And if that's not something that you really enjoy or are willing to make that the centerpiece of how you're going to be successful and happy, you're probably not going to be really happy or successful as a lawyer. And, that's something that I kind of learned to appreciate over the years. And if somebody had kind of explained that to me at the very beginning, I think it would have been really helpful.
This has been a lot of fun for me, Richard, and it's been great to get to know you after I've been able to see you sort of on my computer screen before on your own podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and share some of your wisdom with our audience.
Well, Tyler, it's been a real pleasure. As I said, I usually don't get interviewed. I'm usually the interviewer, but it was really nice talking to you.
Thanks so much. And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Abstract, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd recommend that you give my interview in Season 2 with Mark Cuban, GC at the Oakland Ballers, a listen. We talk about how he transitioned from being a GC to being an executive recruiter, and what his fellow GCs should know about working with exec recruiters. You can also subscribe so you get notified as soon as we post a new episode. And if you liked this one, I'd really love to hear your thoughts, so leave a rating or a comment. If you'd like to reach out to us, our LinkedIn profiles are in the description. See you all next week.